Now, this was a regular train. There were ordinary people on this train. They would have got sprayed with the bacteria as well.
And the big concern there was with sabotage, that somebody would sneak onto a train, sneak into the London Underground and commit an act of sabotage. And these are pervasive fears with biological warfare. They go right back to the 1930s when the evidence was gathered that German spies were trying out the London Underground and the Paris Metro for a German warfare attack.
The railway trials showed that it was feasible to attack passengers by disseminating germs, and demonstrated that Britain's transport system, both above and below ground, was vulnerable to biological attack. The political climate in the 50s was characterised by Cold War paranoia.
You had government bureaucracies that were trying to plan for all eventualities, the worst case scenarios that they could possibly think of, be it nuclear war, biological, chemical war, invasion, internal subversion, and these bureaucracies, they would plan for these situations, they would work out responses to those situations, and they would try and anticipate what those in power might want to ask them, but might fear was too politically sensitive to ask them.
In part 2, we show how this area of Dorset was sprayed with bacteria under cover of darkness. In the 1950s, fears of a biological warfare attack were focused on buildings and transport systems. In the 60s, the government grew alarmed at the possible threat of entire cities being sprayed with toxic agents. This prompted Porton Down scientists to conduct a series of trials using fluorescent particles of zinc-cadmium sulfide, or FP. Although Britain stopped developing its own biological weapons in the mid-50s, documents now declassified show scientists were still discussing the need to defend against an attack. The Ministry of Defence says the trials had to be secret to avoid alerting the enemy, in this case the Soviet Union.
People started to think much more in terms of what's called an off-target attack. In other words, someone would come along, fly a plane or sail a ship, say 200 miles along the English Channel, and slowly release a cloud of biological agents, and this huge cloud would drift across a whole region and poison them. As this idea took hold during the late 1950s, the scientists started to say, well, we've got to do experiments to see whether or not this is a real threat or not. And that's why they were concerned about the potential of the large area coverage and the large area threat.
According to these documents, there was no option but to keep these trials secret, despite some openness in the US about similar trials in the early 1960s. In August 1960, Salisbury and its surrounding area was sprayed with particles of zinc-cadmium sulfide, a chemical which mimicked toxic agents.
So a plane flew about 40 miles away from Salisbury, and for 100 miles it flew in an arc. For 100 miles it was spraying this zinc-cadmium sulfide particles, spraying about £1 per mile, so £100 in all was used. All across Salisbury there was a sampling grid set up. There were two grids set up, one was rural, one was in the centre of the city, and they'd both be monitoring the air. At every one of these stations air monitoring was taking place, and if it had used biological warfare agents, you can see what they were practicing, it would have wiped out the entire city.
Cadmium is a known carcinogen. These trials were done without any toxicology tests being carried out. Normally, when Porton scientists use a simulant for tests, they gave it a T number. This substance had no such number. Even Porton's own official biographer mentions in an internal review how surprising it was that no tests were done before or after the spraying. He concludes there are no reports on toxicity.
They really thought that this was stable. They thought that it wasn't going to cause any harm to anybody and proceeded on that basis. They just assumed that it would be safe.
I don't think they deny that the substance itself is toxic, because they made sure that all their workers wore appropriate protective equipment while using the stuff. They all wore dust masks with Home Office respirator kits. They all made sure that they wore surgeon's caps, surgeon's gloves and overalls, and that the overalls were washed in a special laundry. And the building that the zinc-cadmium sulfide was stored in was demolished by burning. It was incinerated.
Due to public unease, an independent scientist, Professor Peter Lackman, was asked to conduct a review of the use of zinc-cadmium sulfide. But as no official report was produced on the spraying of Salisbury, this was not included in the inquiry. A spokesman for Porton says while some cadmium compounds are undoubtedly toxic, FP is not. It says the Lackman report points out that the available evidence indicates there was no danger to health.
No one knows what happened in Salisbury. They're blissfully unaware. The reason being is that if Porton didn't experiment and they didn't like the trial's results, or they felt that they weren't very good results, they weren't, didn't give what they were looking for, they didn't write up a report. If they didn't write up a report, then that never goes into the Public Record Office. It wasn't given to the independent review. So the residents of Salisbury have no idea that these two trials took place in August of 1960.
Although BW appears easy, defence is difficult. How can an attack be detected quickly? You can't smell it, you can't see it, you can't taste it, you can't feel it, and you can't hear it. Our atmosphere is heavily polluted with all kinds of small particles, so the detection of a disease-causing particle is a complex problem. If costly research produces a detection method, should we make our knowledge public and hence easier for an aggressor to avoid?
The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind.
Back in 1963, Porton planned a series of tests over a large area off the south coast, known as the Dorset Defence Trials. The scientists wanted to see if bacteria which mimicked biological agents sprayed at sea retained harmful effects when drifting inland. Most trials contain E. coli and a bacteria called Bacillus globigii, which occurs naturally in hay and soil. The E. coli, a different strain to the one which causes food poisoning, was isolated from faeces on a toilet seat at Porton Down and cultured in the laboratories.
The ice well was actually used to spray these organisms, and then there was detectors at various points, both on the coast and inland, and these tried to pick up how many of the organisms both landed and how many of them survived, to see how far this cloud would spread.
Now the reason why they came to Lyme Bay is it's a semicircular bay, which means that they can use all sorts of wind directions. So they could put a ship in there, it could sail in a straight line course, spraying bacteria out the back out of an adapted agricultural sprayer. These bacteria were carried onshore and sampled inland by mobile teams.
These trials were done in utmost secrecy. They were done at night, not so much for secrecy, but because the organisms survived better at night, but that added a layer of secrecy. Then on top of that, people were just not told about these experiments. In fact, the documents about the experiments only came to light in around 1997, 1998, so they were kept under wraps for a very long period of time.
Whilst these trials were designed for specific research purposes, they demonstrated in a striking way the feasibility of small-scale biological warfare. An appreciable dose of viable bacteria was achieved over an area greater than 1,000 square miles by the release of only 120 gallons of suspension.
Weymouth, Portland, all of the South Dorset area is pretty unique insofar as that we have had over 80 germ warfare attacks, although that they didn't use pathogens to intentionally cause illness. We have been attacked. All the methods that were used would be used in a germ warfare attack.
Between 1963 and 68, 36 separate bacteria experiments were done in Lyme Bay from the ship Ice Whale. When the secret documents were released 7 years ago, there was such an outcry that an independent review of the possible health hazards was commissioned. The bacterial simulants used in the trials were analysed to see if the population had been put at risk.
E. coli traced with BG means just a mixture of E. coli and Bacillus globigii, and the reason that those two bacteria were used were, first of all, Bacillus globigii forms very, very stable, tough spores, and that is used to simulate the behaviour of anthrax.